tool called COS Read that pulls apart data sets, and there's also a future tool presently called Get COS that a site wrote to read COS archiving tapes. So does NCAR run archiving? And I know 01 probably does. I don't really have much information on that tool yet, though. The menu system, we're just going to touch upon. The menu system is available on your terminals, on the Ampex terminals, and you'll be able to type in menu and see what a front-end version of it looks like. Very little time spent there. The Jcl Converter. Those that are interested in user-level Jcl conversion, this is where you probably want to spend a lot of time and learn how to modify the converter to do specific things at your site, to put up text. I have an interactive tool now called COS Help, and then you type in the COS command line and it pops a converted version out on your screen. And you may want to put in support text and stuff like that, you know, explanations and things. These are a preliminary version of something I've done that aren't officially supported yet. And sites have taken them and simply worked them into what they want to do with them. So it's a tool that can also deal with NQS COS job conversion and stuff like that. But it's got to be tweaked to the way the site sets up their system, the way they run temporary files and NQS jobs, those sorts of things. The Jcl Converter is available on all the machines here in Mendota Heights, but I have my own questions. Now, there are all kinds of materials that I recommend be involved in this course, but I didn't hand them out. We'll hand them out, I think, as interest, one-by-one case of what you want. And 2011 manuals, things like that. You've got all the software migration notes, and that's what all of these things down here are. Everything in here is in your anthology that you have supplemental to your workbook. But if you want user guides, administrator guides, I think during a break you let me know what you want. If you want, you can just pull the page and mark what you want. Because right now we're coming up to a 5.0 release, and I wasn't sure whether you wanted 4.0 information and stuff. So I'm leaving it up to you to mark off what materials you want to take back with you. And anything not on the list I can provide as well. So I decided not to stack. For each Jcl command, it gives the UNICOS counterpart. It also gives it down to the option level. Every option is mapped into whether it's supported in UNICOS or not in Appendix B. And Appendix C lists all the unsupported library calls. So if nothing else, you should be able to use Appendix A, B, and C to answer questions or to look up what's going on in a UNICOS area. And I'm also working on the COS 117 resource management and system-oriented mapping as well. What you've got in the appendices are still a 4.0 system. A 116 4.0 system is what the appendices are right now. And I'm in the process of updating them to 117 5.0. We're going to compare COS and UNICOS features, understand where you can find information on the UNICOS counterpart of a COS feature. Know what software migration or migration software is available. There's a migration tools tape, and there are certain tools that are written, and we're going to talk about each one of them. Know what publications are available. I'm still surprised when I go out on site and people haven't heard of software migration notes. And they are available. They've been available for years and constantly being updated as we find information. There are a couple of private or pre-release migration notes that you're going to get here as well in the administrative and migration planning area. So we're constantly updating these things, and what you've got is about 3-4 months old, which is old in this area. Know how to gather site statistics. Use the migration planning tools to determine what users do what with your system. And it's also surprising when you go out on site and how many people do not really know what their query is being used for and don't have a real good idea of what major application or the heavy usage applications, how often they're being used, and the real usage of the system and what they do. Yeah?
Is this on a job basis, or can you actually gather site statistics about what software is being used?
Well, it's an extract analyzer. that analyzes all the CSP messages for consistencies. And it gives the command, how often it's used, and the user and ownership that's associated with that job. So if it doesn't actually, you can add applications to the list if you know what they're being run as by name.
For example, could you ask for each job to show the load map that's generated there?
No. A load map being generated by segloader?
No.
Well, that isn't really kept in a $log format, and this just analyzes CSP $log messages. Segloader maps would be going to a $out, and that's not really kept on the system.
Okay.
So there's no real way of tracking that sort of information. A site would have to modify their system to, with segloader itself, save it not only to $out, but to some other data set, and then to write a tool to analyze that. That'd be the only way you could do it. But that's assuming everybody turns the map on and all that sort of thing. It would probably be a segloader modification only, and then a new tool to analyze the database it generates. But this is analyzing just the JCL commands. You could add commands to it. So if you've got a particular application that you want to see how often it's being used, and you know its name, you can search for it if they actually invoke it with that name. So we'll see what that tool does more specifically. And the other one was job size, which analyzes memory size on job termination records. And both of them hook up to extract. They just analyze extract output. So gathering site statistics also entails some surveying and some polling of the actual community that you have out there, and some surveys and techniques like this. And the Migration Planning Guide has examples of survey information you should gather to help plan your migration on site, so that you know who's got CAL modules, who's got large procedure libraries. The things that take the amount of time are the things you've got to find as soon as possible. And we're going to talk about the things that take time to redesign. So selecting the migration path is dealing with whether you're going to use a second machine, which I know 01 Systems is doing, and it sounds like NCAR is going to do the same sort of thing. You can also use a ghost environment. You can also use native off hours. Some sites use both ghost and native off hours time slots, a variety of things like that. There's materials up here if you want them. I can bring them back there. And then to set up a migration plan. A smooth migration is one where problems don't pop up on you. You know where the time is going to be spent and plan for it in advance and know what it's going to take to deal with that particular problem. Avoiding problems and preparing for problems is when a migration is smooth. So a migration plan is to help go through the steps and determine where things are going to be slowing you down, and put together a whole time frame, so to speak, of what this migration project is going to be like, which is constantly modified on site. The typical thing that slows down a migration on site is third-party bureaucracy and getting a third party interested in getting that thing implemented on UNICOS and licensed to you so that you can run it. And that's, on most sites, what actually is the last thing that stops them from going full UNICOS production, is one or two applications where that's a problem. So those things take a lot of time, third-party diplomacy. So those are the basic things that we're going to be focusing on in the next 2 days. And then the last 3 days you'll be able to get involved in the particulars that you want to deal with. Now, the question is often asked, we're going to section 1 now. There are two questions to answer at this point. Why did Cray go to Unix, and why does the site want to go to Unix? And the site's reasons may be different than Cray's reasons. But a site should not be pushed or forced into a migration if they're really not ready for it. Now, prior to UNICOS 5.0, there were a lot of sites out there that needed COS 117 feature capabilities. and that's what's held them up at this point. After 5.0, basically everything's there, and sites are tending to cascade and all jump on the bandwagon at this point. So the thing that's been holding up a site from going to UNICOS has been removed, so to speak, now that we have 5.0 coming out. Anybody interested in using 5.0 should be well past the planning process and into the actual planning and doing process of a migration. And there are things that you can do before you actually install UNICOS. Lots of things you can do, including coming to Mendota and setting up user databases and planning file system configurations, NQS configurations. When it comes in the door, all that's tested a couple of times and basically implemented the way you're going to run it on site. So there's a lot of preparation that can be done to make the installation smoother. And from that point on, the UNICOS installation is smooth. Cray chose Unix because several years ago, first of all, we thought that Unix was becoming an industry standard. And I'd say this primarily had to do with things like the Suns and X Windows and TCP and the whole networking environment. The number of users that were using Unix was increasing. I think primarily because AT&T was smart in giving university systems easier access to source and Unix systems. And we get a lot of people coming out of the college environment that want Unix. And this has made Unix very popular in the scientific market and the computer science market as well. And we wanted to provide a Unix system for Cray users so that we don't have to train them on COS, for one thing. How many people can go out to your local bookstore and find a book on COS? You won't even find a mention of COS in any bookstore in your town, I can guarantee you. Speed of implementation. One of the key things that Cray was looking at was 5-6 years ago, we had Seymour Cray walk in the software development building, put an aquarium down, drop some electronics in it, and start talking about the Cray 2. And we saw that the Cray 2 was nothing like the Cray 1 or the XMP. We saw proliferation of hardware, designs, and architectures, and we needed an operating system that was not written in assembly language, because we wanted something we could maintain across architectures. Cray with UNICOS has done something we never did in the past. When the YMP was installed here in Mendota Heights, we had a full operating system running on it. Whole new architecture, and the day it was installed, everything was up and running. Before UNICOS, we did not have that. And now we have an operating system that we can implement on our architectures very quickly and easily. Portability is what ties into this. When we looked at the Unix operating system, we saw that it had proven portability across a variety of architectures, down into PCs, IBMs will run Unix, etc. So it was easy to port the system. It'd be very difficult to port COS to as many architectures as there are Unix systems. Functionality. When we began with Unix, it was really a software development environment. With the tools, the features that we've added to make UNICOS, we've turned it more into a supercomputer production environment. We've added things like online tapes and security and things that simply aren't in a Unix environment. And this is primarily because our customers are used to services that they were expecting from COS. And that we needed security, we needed archiving, we needed all these things because a Cray is used differently than a PC sitting on your desk or a PDP-11, which is what Unix was originally written for. But I think we've turned it into a software development environment, into a scientific production environment. And that with UNICOS 4.0, it outperformed COS in a 341 batch job mix thrown at two systems, both configured with the same hardware. And UNICOS outperformed COS and finished sooner. And we can talk about some of that later. Performance is now proven, as I mentioned, better than COS, though I'm sure that you can find particular cases, applications or configuration problems where COS is tuned better than UNICOS. But once you get through that tuning process, UNICOS can outperform COS. There are file system differences, and this is the biggest thing that can slow down a performance of an application, is what's the system doing with your I/O, and is the system striped, and how is the data set laid out across the system and stuff. And I do think that there are several or a lot of COS people that feel that the COS file system is a little bit easier to configure and therefore get the performance you want out of it. Existing applications and utilities, we're every day adding new applications. We have a UNICOS application directory that if anybody wants it, we can get it to them of what's officially supported on UNICOS at the time of the release of the catalog. I have an application conversion class. Anybody that has codes can come into that class and get the code converted if they need UNICOS time. But both sites, I think, have UNICOS services, and you're better off doing it on site and using the system that you have there. One thing that UNICOS does have, though, that COS doesn't, is the software development environment. It's interactive capabilities, it's debugging capabilities, and things that are just archaic to a batch system like COS. Now, once the application is implemented, it's typically a long run, and you're going to convert it back to an NQS batch type job. But to get the thing running and to maintain it and all these other support features are typically done in an interactive mode. And you can add a user. There's an interactive flag and a batch flag that you can add to the user database in 5.0 to say, let's give this guy interactive access for 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, he can use CDBX and various other development environment tools and implement whatever code it is that he has. And then typically these things run for a long time, and they're not interactive type codes. You then convert them back to an NQS job and run them in a production environment. But it really depends upon the application. There are applications that are interactive, and I've seen weather modeling applications designed for interactive, X windows and all that sort of thing. We had an interesting demonstration of an intern project this summer on a weather model system that was interactively designed. Though he said the actual performance, particularly on the graphic display, was not up to what he needed for full performance. Finally, Cray was looking at a common operating system for all Cray systems. We have 2 architecture lines presently, the XMPEA machines and the Cray 2 machine line, with newer projects coming on like the YMP being installed and the follow-on to the YMP and the follow-on to the Cray 2, the Cray 3, and whatever Seymour comes up with after that. And we feel that as Seymour implements a totally new architecture on us and says, now that I've got this technology, I'm going to do it this way, we can implement that operating system very quickly, we feel. And that's the main reason, I think, that we chose Unix. The shorter design cycle of our hardware, we had to have software that could follow that. A site should also consider why do they want to go to Unix or UNICOS, and make sure the users are aware of that. Start talking to your users through your user services bulletins and things like that. Let them get involved. Let them feel a part of that decision-making process so they don't feel like they're being bulldozed over by some decision that upper management has made. And that can make the migration smoother too, and find the people that are going to be resistant to it because it's certain amount of work involved for them, and they don't want to do that. I've been on site where those certain people may be close to retirement or just got finished converting the thing to COS. A variety of situations that have occurred out there where they just really don't want to go through the effort right now. But I think you can show that it's easy to do, provided you know what they're doing and can get their questions answered. Migration really is involved in 2 portions. There's the application side of it, getting the codes converted. Sometimes it's a third party, sometimes it's a scientific community, a wide variety of people out there that may have to do the work. A lot of sites, it's not one person on site converting all these codes massively. You get a wide variety of backgrounds, etc., involved in this migration project. And keep in mind that there's a trade-off here in portability. Converting your code into the UNICOS environment, how portable are you going to keep it? And the fact that the code may have been tuned to a COS environment. Any codes manipulating DNTs, DSPs, and doing I/O from Cal is a candidate for a tuning problem because it's going to have to be tuned differently in UNICOS and use buffering techniques, etc., differently in UNICOS, LD cache, etc. So when you deal with these particular problems, you have to consider the portability aspect of it once it's implemented on UNICOS and going from UNICOS to UNICOS machines as well. We generally don't recommend Cal being rewritten in Cal. We, in a lot of cases, will recommend re-implementing the algorithm in C or Fortran unless it's something particular to character manipulation or things like that. But it's very difficult to maintain Cal across all the future machines. What if you've got a Cray 3 and a YMP in your same computer room and you're running the code on both? There's always a trade-off between portability and performance and tuning the application. And you got to decide how far you're going to go and those sorts of things. And realize that getting the performance in UNICOS is going to be a different technique than getting it in COS was. And we're going to talk about the tools that will help that conversion process. But migration must also consider the administrative, operational, and system support side of this, getting the user database maintained and getting the people that add the users, etc., up to speed to add users on UNICOS, and operators to bring the system up and down, things like that. Now, several years ago, a software migration project was started, what we call a software migration team, and it meets once a month. In fact, it's meeting tomorrow morning. And if everyone's interested in going to that, I can see if we can go over there tomorrow morning, see what's going on. I'll talk about that later. One of the things that we've done is tried to document as much as possible in the migration experiences that we've had and to get software migration notes available. And these are all available in distribution. And this is the last list that I have. There may be changes going on in this area because I've been trying to get all of them put into anthologies, a user anthology and a systems anthology, so that you don't get them in small little pieces, but get them in a proper sequence and all that sort of thing, to try to merge them together into a solid document. But we have an introduction to migration note collection. By the way, all of these are in your anthology except for what I handed out loose as supplemental. There's a UNICOS philosophy document. This is a good document to spread out to your user community right away. Let them know, philosophically, how is the system designed, what's it maintained, maintainability is like, stuff like that. We also have a security comparison. This is a little old right now, but it was an Orange Book COS and a UNICOS 3.0 comparison. It does not include the security feature. It's a standard Unix security comparison, really. There's also a migration planning guide. Now, this was supplemental on the side. It was not in your anthology. And this is something I've put together from all the experiences and watching sites go through this process. And it's also from collecting their migration plans and looking at them and adding that information into my migration plan. So a lot of the information in there came from various sites and was then squeaked and tuned into a single product, so to speak. But everybody had something to say, and we put it in there. There's also a document describing the site analysis tools. COS Jcl is the only one documented right now. Job size is not officially released. It's something that's sitting in various directories and is available if you want it. It's written in Fortran. There's also a COS UNICOS equivalency document. Now, I have not provided this to you. It was done about a year ago, available at CUG. Instead, you have the exact same information in your workbook. It's redundant, in some cases word for word, but in a different sequence, in a more logical sequence. So I saw and see no reason for you to even look at that document because everything it has to say is exactly the same in my workbook. I spend a lot more space on the same sorts of things. But if you want to get a copy of it, feel free. It's just a different format than my workbook. There's also an XMP Cray 2 operational differences document just describing the differences between the two systems, useful in planning portability of dual architectures for your application. There's also a guest operating system document, 7013. This is presently, anything that you've seen right now is a 1.16 version, 1.16.3.0 version. And anything 1.17.4.0 is in a pre-release mode right now and is still being reviewed. So you've got old GOES information both in your workbook and in the anthology. It's 1.16 stuff. And I will get you some 1.17 information, but not the whole set because it's still pre-release. There's a document in there about migration of Cray 1 Cal to Cray 2. What are the macro differences, entry points? The entry point techniques are different between the two systems and entry calls and stuff. There's a very good document on JCL guide to COS Unicos migration, and this is what Teresa actually is maintaining right now and doing a 1.17 5.0 version of it, 4.0 and 5.0. The one you presently have is a 3.0 version, the one that was on the side with the software migration planning guide. We also have a Cray Fortran environments in COS and Unicos. This is for the Fortran programmer talking about the two systems. Some tape examples in there, stuff like that. COS file conversion. This is primarily talking about COS read and how you can pull apart COS block dataset structures or COS PDS format dataset structures. And we'll get a chance to use that. The next one is COS to Unicos Jcl conversion utilities, and this talks about the Jcl converter. Anybody interested in tuning and programming that thing, this is how the templates are designed, and describes the template language, really, on what to do in mapping each command. PL copy is the utility that converts COS update program libraries to Unicos format. Now, there are some changes going on in there. Update is going away on Unicos, and there's a thing being called new update, or N update. And it has longer deck name capability, a Unix type deck capability, really. And there's also a new utility called SM, Source Maintenance Utility, coming out with Unicos 5.0. And this is Cray's future source maintenance utility. And it's basically update, SECS, and SCUM all mixed together into one. And after Tuesday, anybody interested in it, I could talk to the developer, I can give you some information myself, and we can touch upon USM. PL copy will be making changes with 5.0 to support converting the library to a variety of formats rather than just COS update to the old Unicos update format, because there is a new update version. COS Unicos application conversion aids. This one deals with $dummylib. That's the primary thing that's in it. And the utility that generates $dummylib is called putpdt, that you run on Unicos to generate this COS library and then transfer it to COS. The application conversion techniques article. This is the one that you're going to use to cover library call differences. The one you have is a 4.0 version. We're in the process of updating it and adding a list of each library call and what to do on a case-by-case basis. But that's still in development process. Presently, it just talks about iShell and memory management, some of those things. But this is the one that's going to be covering the libraries, whereas the 7018 is the one that's going to cover the JCL. Those would be the key two guides that you give to your users to help them convert. There's also another one here to deal with system action requests for COS to Unicos. Call system, or if you're in CAL modules, doing a $$ type of call and normal exchange, which EXP then processes. So we cover those on a case-by-case basis as well. And that may also be something that you would want to provide to your users and at least make them aware that it's available if they call a system. Most of them can be converted. The ones that manipulate DNTs and DSPs, LFTs, that sort of thing, are the ones that are going to have to be redesigned because they're doing I.O. that's COS specific. Those are those I.O. optimized, COS I.O. optimized modules that you're going to have to re-implement and think out differently. There's a tool available for accounting, and this is being put into standard UNICOS 5.0. It's called ACCT, and it was something that a site originally wrote to simulate what they were doing with their COS accounting. It is being put into UNICOS 5.0 as a standard supported tool. It's called CSA FEF for Cray System Accounting Front-End Formatter. And we can touch upon what that does, but it is basically in here an obsolete tool, and I haven't seen the 5.0 version of it yet. I haven't run it yet. And there's also a migration or a menu system guide that just is designed for a user that is going to use menu. That's something the site is going to have to decide on, whether they want menu available, particularly to scientists, that sort of thing. There's one other migration note that's going to be available. I'm presently working on with a writer called an operational migration guide. Its title may change by the time it's released. We've had a couple of different names for it because we haven't really figured out what describes it best. But the number's always been the same. So it's an SMN 7023. And this is what's going to compare the COS SM44 and SM43 manuals to the UNICOS information. Administrator commands to UDB gen and archiving, all the administrative type stuff. So anything that was found in the SM44 or SM43 is described in this document. And those are not user type of things. And you've got some of the information in the back of your workbook in the appendices, mapping station commands, mapping iOS operator commands, and mapping the 1.16 to 4.0 administrative commands, but I'm working on the 5.0 stuff. And by Friday, I should be able to get you all a copy of the 5.0, 1.17 versions on the operational stuff. There's also a bunch of software training documents. You've got one of them, the Migration Planning Workbook. Now, the Migration Tools Usage Workbook, MIGR, is exactly the same workbook. One's a 2-day version, one's a 5-day version. And I'll get those that are interested the Application Conversion Workbook. And you already have the Migration Anthology. You're also going to find in the Migration Anthology a variety of design documents and pieces of documentation that really don't fit anywhere. Share scheduler documentation and stuff like that. There's also a COS Ghost workbook. Anybody interested in that, I can get them a copy. And also a UNICOS Accounting and Systems Logs workbook, but that's still a 4.0 workbook. It has not been updated to 5.0. So there's quite a bit of useful information. When 5.0 is actually released, all this should be in place for the 5.0 versions of everything as well. Now the tools. The migration tools have really been a collection of pieces of things that we've gathered from everywhere. They haven't really officially been supported, though they've been released and available in distribution. But they're constantly changing, and there hasn't been anyone assigned to supporting them up until now. And we do have somebody assigned to them now. But these are what they are. The site analysis tools I mentioned, COS Jcl analyzes extract CSP messages and tells you how often a JCL verb is used. Job size looks at job termination records from extract and tells you what memory utilization you're using and the time of day and how long that thing ran. It tells you time of run and stuff too. And that's not officially available. It's sitting in directories, and you can link it, download it, copy it, take it if you want. $dummy_lib is an empty library available on COS only for COS application users to, when they run SegLoader, they link to this instead of the default libraries. It then tells them which missing library calls they'll find. And this does cover get param and stuff, things that may be in libcos. And putPDT is what runs on UNICOS to generate this $dummy_lib. Now, somebody was interested in IMSL and NAG type entry points. A site that wants to generate this $dummy_lib unique to their site can do that on UNICOS. So they could put those entry points on their UNICOS system, regenerate this library, put it on COS, and then COS users won't have to worry about it. But presently, a user calls up and says, I got a bunch of entry points from such and such a library missing, and the application support person knows whether they're available on UNICOS or not. And that's the way it's worked. But I know a couple of sites that have regenerated this library unique to the way their site libraries are. And that's PutPDT. That, by the way, only runs on the XMP. It doesn't work on the Cray2. There's a library call that's different. So it will only work for the XMP YMP line, not the Cray2 system. A couple of other tools that are useful in the migration project are to convert LDR to segloader. Anybody that's using LDR, stop them. Get them off LDR. Find out why they're using it. It's an old product. It does overlay segmentation differently. Prior to this, UNICOS 4.0, it was not supported. LDR was not supported on UNICOS. But there is an LDR called LDOVL on UNICOS now. And this does the same sort of thing as LD2 does on COS. It converts LDR to segloader format and does call segloader. But you may just want to encourage them to use segloader by default. And if they can't use it, it may be because of overlay techniques. And then you know that that person's a candidate for different programming techniques on a Cray2, for example, where you've got lots of memory space. Do you really want to segment that application? So segmentation is something you should look at very carefully. I might also point out that segmentation does work better on COS than UNICOS. UNICOS 4.0 at least has a performance problem in comparing to COS. 5.0, they think they're up to speed and at least as fast as COS with segloader segmentation. But there's a problem in there. And it's also something that's going to be file system sensitive depending upon how you configure your file system. So get them onto new tools. GOS. GOS is a migration tool that's supported with the COS and UNICOS releases. It's not on a migration tools tape. When you get COS, you automatically have the capability of bringing up UNICOS. It's built in by default. There's no flag that you set to turn GOS on in UNICOS, or in COS, I mean. In UNICOS, you make one line change and regenerate the kernel. You go into what's called a make file, change a native line to null, remake the kernel, and then transfer that to the COS system, file system. And that's all you have to do to bring up GOS. So COS is built in by default. UNICOS, you regenerate it. With it, you also have the capability of an internal station. If your database is on COS disk, on the COS file system, the internal station is a likely candidate to get those things onto the UNICOS file system. And this would be through memory vector register type transfers. So if your file system, if your database is off on the front ends, then you're going to do everything through the stations. But the internal station is useful for databases that are on the Cray disk, moving them from the COS file system to the UNICOS file system. CPU scheduling enhancements. With COS 117, there's a change GOS command that allows you to run multiple CPUs on UNICOS and to dynamically schedule them. So there's work in both systems. You set up a ratio that says guarantee COS gets 75%. And then he says both systems are busy. Does COS have 75%? If it doesn't, he goes to COS. If it does, he goes to UNICOS. So you can set up a guaranteed ratio of how much CPU utilization you're going to give to COS. And also memory allocation. With UNICOS 5.0 and COS 117, on UNICOS you can execute a CHMEM command. And CHMEM is supposedly going to be backstitched into 4.0, but it's a 5.0 feature. And it will make a request to COS to change the memory size. So this allows, for example, a cron type entry in UNICOS, which is a time event, to change memory size, for example, in a midnight production mode for particular jobs. So CHMEM can be automatically triggered or executed by the operator to change memory allocation between GOS or COS UNICOS systems on GOS. Yeah?
Is there any reason to go to 117 if you're not going to go to GOS?
No, not that I can think of in particular. Resource management is another feature that's not in 116. I don't know any particulars other than that. On the user level, there's only one page of changes on the 20 or the 11 manual, the SR11. So
Okay, thank you.
I can show you what those user differences are. And I don't know about libraries, but libraries seems to me they should be able to port anyways. There's multitasking. The science libraries are now multitasked. That's something.
Okay.
That's something. I can't think of going down the feature list, but to a site at the user level, that'd be something worth their performance. There's a new dollar multi-lib type stuff. But
Would it be possible to get the feature list while we're here?
I can get you the release notice and take it from there. I don't really know of a feature list as such, but that can start us off. So CPU memory allocation are new with COS 117 for GOS, and it makes it a much more dynamic environment. There's a new thing. It has been called libmig, and that's what I have on the system that I've been playing with. But there's a new product coming out called libcos, and supposedly this will be in the 5.0 release. Again, this is preliminary information. In libcos is getParam, something that's going to be called memory. We've been fighting over whether to call it memory or expand. The question being that if you give somebody an entry point and they're not aware that they're using a bridge type routine and they use some obscure method, that they may run into a debugging problem. And that they should be aware that this call exists in there. Also in there is PPL, and there's going to be some timestamp routines and a variety of other entry points. It's gone through several iterations of what we want to do in this area. We do not intend at this point to support Jcl entry points like call assign, things like that. Also, I have to point out, and this is a big bullet for user people, is that the access entry point is going to link in UNICOS, and it's a system call completely different than access in COS. What this is an entry point name collision. One in out of the 1,000 or 2,000 isn't too bad, but it's probably the worst one that it could happen on. So applications that call access will pass segloader in both the $dummy and on UNICOS. What I've typically done is recommend a grep for access through the source to see what you've got in there. Or you could even tell them to grep call access or something to find that thing, because that may save them some debugging problems. We have found it accidentally in cases where we found another entry point unsupported right next to it. And they were so close that we saw the other one and was able to deal with it right away. But call access will link in UNICOS to a system call named access. So that's a big danger area, trouble area that you could hit. So we do not intend to put into libcos assign, access, any of those sorts of things. In those cases, you're typically going to call iShell. And iShell is a new call for UNICOS, and it basically executes a C system library call, which executes shell commands. So it allows you to execute at the shell level. One area that you will not be able to deal with in this is like getSym or setSym. setJSym is the one I'm thinking of. setJSym has no meaning in UNICOS. We'll talk about that later. But the fact that environment variables in UNICOS are not inherited up to parent processes makes it difficult for an application to manipulate it and pass it up the hierarchy of child-parent relationships and inherit it up. So that one may be another big area of problem that we cannot deal with, and we're discussing options in that area. Sense switches will not be supported. SCOL will not be supported. So those are some of the things that simply will not be in libcos and will be empty entry points. We also have an accounting package that was originally written at Harwell and updated and maintained, and this is being released with UNICOS 5.0 standard as CSA FEF. And it does have an SMF record version. Does anybody use IBM front ends and SMF records? Do you know? A lot of sites maintain all their accounting statistics off on an IBM system in SMF record formats and then have accounting packages that run on MVS to go through those statistics. So this will support that. The Jcl Converter. This is a commonly discussed tool that most people are aware of. It's available on both COS and UNICOS. The COS version, you need a particular compiler in order to execute it, though, and I really don't know what compiler version it is. I think it was the 3.0 compiler. But there is a problem on the C environment for this application because it won't work in the latest production system here. So I don't have it working right now on COS, but I do have it available on UNICOS. It's basically composed of 4 C programs. There's CJ Print. In my opinion, I wouldn't release it. It just numbers your lines. It just, shows you what you've got. It doesn't do anything. Most people don't use it. They'd rather just get to the work. They don't need more paper to confuse them on what they've got. CJCL is the body of this Jcl converter. This is a two-pass template converter. And it references things on the first pass for pre-knowledge, for example, SPY, things like that, so that on the second pass, he has pre-knowledge of that command and can deal with it when he first encounters it. And the second pass is where the majority of conversion takes place. And we're going to take a look at these templates. The templates are named Pass 1 and Pass 2 by default, but I've now set up 4 sets of templates. One for interactive, one for online documentation help, one for NQS jobs, and then the full-blown Pass 1 and Pass 2 as they're originally released. I basically took the full-blown ones and cropped them down and created 3 additional versions. And we'll get to those later. CJProc is a preprocessor to CJCL. And it deals with $n/EOF's procedures. You need both of these together. And I put together a shell script called COS help, which is just a one-line CJProc, pipe it into CJCL, and use different templates than Pass 1 and Pass 2. And that's what I typically am showing people right now, is I type in COS help, the command line, and then it pops back to the screen the converted version and maps options and stuff like that. But a site could then go into the template and add text and tune it to the way they want to support that conversion on UNICOS, on their site. There's also a tool called CJPlib, and CJPlib converts $proc format data sets back into proc in proc. It recovers your procedure library if you've ever been in that position. So it is a useful tool in that respect. Typically, though, you hope you have the original source so that you know what you've got. Large procedure libraries are probably the area that CJProc is useful in, but it can also make a big mess because it may map things inconsistently, or not in a Unix fashion, but in a COS fashion. And this is something you got to decide on, is whether you want to perpetuate COS thinking at the JCL level into UNICOS. There are sites out there that ran out of JCL variables, J0 through J7 and stuff, and started doing bit manipulations on that. And to map that into UNICOS really would not make any sense. Yeah?
Don't you think that having a JCL converter might actually
Yeah, sure.
help this?
That's why COS help is there, because it just maps the options, and if the option maps straight off, it shows you. And right now, if it doesn't map off, it silently ignores and throws away anything that shouldn't, perpetuate. So COS help itself would not perpetuate that.
I guess what I'm worried about is having a JCL converter might actually foster people thinking in COS.
Yeah, it could. In a particular version, I have one called COS, and I can type in COS in the command line, and it'll convert it and execute it, which is really terrible. But everything maps. And when we go through the user level process, if you're using It's a batch mapping, though, that it should be done in, and if the person's going to be consistent in a batch mapping, it is pretty straightforward. So this COS help will just, if you, for example, do a write-eds, it won't pop anything back right now. But most of the things, access, it'll pop back TPMNT and at least tell you the command and the option name. So it kind of helps you go from point A to point B online. But then you can, restructure your job and how you're going to implement it differently. It just tells you what's the name for that option. So in that sense, I think it's useful. But I agree that it can be very dangerous, in this area, depending upon what particular thing they're doing you're talking about is. Because most things do translate. Update is going to be a one-to-one, line-by-line type thing. It also converts names to lowercase from uppercase. COS help does. Stuff like that. So, yeah, there's a balance there that has to be found. And that's why you should learn to tune them, so that you can pop whatever it is you want to tell them about that thing. But you'd be surprised how much does pretty much translate. You just have to watch what you're doing. JCL variables, different things like that that can get you into trouble. But compile, load, and go is still the same on UNICOS. So that's the Jcl converter, and we're going to come back and talk about that a lot more. There's also a cal conversion for Cray 1 cal to Cray 2. I don't recommend this. I'm not sure that we're going to release it in the future, but it was something that somebody put together for their project, and in particular it was converting the science libraries or something like that. And we hung on to it. It maps B&T registers into local memory and deals with instruction set differences, does not deal with macros and entry point differences. And it's not a very intelligent tool. I'm not even going to talk about it in this class. I don't think it should be recommended to any user. USCP is a standard UNICOS feature. Back in UNICOS early days, we felt that USCP implemented on UNICOS would give us two advantages. Number one, allow COS sites to drop a UNICOS machine into their site and use it in the same way. The user sees the same usage as he did in COS. What he's submitting is going to be modified, but the way he uses it is the same. The worst thing you want to do to a user is change everything on him at once. Try going from Cray 1 running COS to a Cray 2 running UNICOS with different compilers and different front ends possibly and everything. There are sites that have done that. And they've sometimes regretted it, changing everything at once. Front ends, compilers, operating systems, everything. The other thing that USCP gives us, though, is the ability to sell machines that we're selling COS into. In other words, the station allows us to interface into a wider variety of environments than just TCP does. And we can put UNICOS into those backwoods sites now that are still running MVS and 3270s and stuff like that. File format conversion. COS read, I talked about, pulls apart blocked and PDS format data sets. The second one has its name right now called get COS. Oops. And it's being used out on one particular site right now. PL copies there, I mentioned that. It converts a COS PL to a UNICOS PL. In 5.0, there's a variety of options that PL copy will be able to do. The network queuing system. This is what gives us the batch interface. And the network queuing system really is a job card scheduler mechanism for shell scripts. And NQS has directives to help tell the system what sorts of resources he needs and then can schedule them appropriately. And lastly, the menu system. And the menu system simply allows a scientist to get up on the system quickly, and is based upon an SPF environment. You do have it available on your terminals here when we get started. Yeah.
I do have one question.
Sure.
Do you envision updates as being supported in the long term?
I had thought that up until a couple of weeks ago. I think USM is the what they intend to be their ultimate tool, but that's more for the UNICOS, Cray, the way Cray works environment. Like I mentioned earlier, we can get the developer to come in and talk a little bit about what's going on in this area. I'll discuss it with them.
Well, I think that's good.
It really depends upon whether you're used to update. To me, the advantage of update was always the fact that you had one inode in the search path going through the file system for 300, 400, 500 decks. And it doesn't make sense to have directories with that large number of inodes that a file system search has to go through. And that's the thing. I think that was its advantage in COS as well, to keep the data set catalog manageable, etc. USM is it's been called USM, but if you do a man space SM on the system we're using this week, you will be on a 5.0 system this week. Man space SM, you'll get the man pages for it, and that's the only documentation for it in 5.0. In 6.0, there will be manual support, but pubs will not have 5.0 support for it. But it was only a couple weeks ago I heard that update was being changed to be N update and would support longer deck names and periods in the deck name and stuff like that. And a whole change in that area. So, migration issues. What to worry about on site. First of all, use the newest products. With COS 117, you've got everything is basically default Cal version 2. Seg loader's been around for a long time. Make sure your users are using it. Maybe goes as drastic a step as removing LDR from the system directory. That'll find the users quick, right? CFT77 is an option. We've always recommended it because then when you go to the Cray 2, etc., you've got some portability. You've got to make a decision on what you're going to support on site. And one of the issues is standards on site when your users are implementing their applications. If they all take the same path, it's easier to support. Offering multiple compilers complicates the support problem. And we do have 1.14 bug fix 8 available on UNICOS, and some sites have used that. But this is a tough decision that you're going to have to make on site, and I would recommend you go with one and not try to offer a variety. CFT77 has its advantages in what it can catch in vectorization and disadvantages in memory consumption and compilation time because it's doing a lot more work. And secondly, there was never any intent that binaries on COS would run on UNICOS. In fact, we've never really committed, to my knowledge, that a COS binary from 1.16 would run on 1.17, or a UNICOS 2.0 binary runs on UNICOS 5.0. A lot of other companies may commit in that upward grade capability, but that locks them in. And we cannot be locked in. We want performance. And that's why we've kind of approached it that way. So I have heard rumors of another company that said they could run COS binaries on their Unix machine, and I have not found truth to that yet. So, missing library routines. You are going to have missing library routines. This is especially syslib, and that's in particular Jcl commands: call access, call delete, call release, call assign, those sorts of things. UNICOS has a migration library to debug these entry points, and we're working on a plan for each one of these and documenting the ones that will not be supported, what to do about it in UNICOS. IL subtleties. First of all, file position will always be rewound between commands. There will never be any plan or any intent to support file position across job steps. That is a COS feature that's kind of inherited from scope and other environments on small machines where they segmented the application into multiple executing steps. And it's the only place that we've ever found that it's been needed. I've never found an application to need it. The most common usage of this is on $in. That can be dealt with easily with file manipulation on UNICOS, here documents, and a variety of techniques. Head, tail, stream editors, things like that. It's only in the application job steps where the application is broken up into executing step 1, step 2, step 3, and expecting file position on Fortran units and things like that to be consistent. Those are the applications that you're going to have to really re-implement on UNICOS. Basically what you can do is put them all into one job step. Has some sort of entry point program that calls them in sequence, or just link them together as one and have some sort of linkage between them in one job step. If you ever do find an application like that, give me a call and we'll start talking about it. We found one that was a NASTRAN offshoot of some sort that was dealt with. And one out of all the ones we've seen isn't too bad. So I don't think that that's a problem. And if it is, let's start dealing with that problem right away. We've been putting out calls for 2 years to find these codes, and we found one in 2 years, so let us know. We cannot mix binary and character I/O in the same file. I think this was a case where they were doing that formatted, unformatted reads and writes into the same file, reading it in and out with buff in, buff out, and stuff like that. When you get into the I/O area, you can find programmers doing a variety of different things that are unique to them. I don't know of any case, I haven't seen any case where this has been identified as what they were doing and as a problem, but it has been highlighted as something you cannot do. Sometimes in portability things, and even across compilers and stuff, a lot of the discussions is what is standard and, you know, what should you or should you not be able to do in that programming environment. And taking a look at the techniques that are being used and whether they're valid programming techniques or if there's a better way to do it. There are basically 3 file formats in UNICOS versus the 2 in COS. The new one is called text. And text is what the file manipulation tools need, the editors, the stream editors, that sort of thing. We have text format, which is what your editors work on. It's standard Unix text. We also have blocked format. This blocked format is basically a straight port of COS libraries to UNICOS, the formatted I/O libraries, where in CAL and COS and in UNICOS 4.0 they were ported. The only difference in the file format now is that in COS, a null record had a blank in it. And in UNICOS, a null record is a null record, nothing in it. This was a debate problem because a couple of our customers, when they upgraded to 4.0, all of their verification suites suddenly spit out blanks saying our 3.0 verified versions were all nulls, and now we're getting all these blanks on these records. So that is a difference between the two. The Cray2 is also supporting block structures in UNICOS 5.0. I might point out that most of the library mapping really is best to the XMP, and the XMP follows COS compatibility the best because they came from COS, most of the developers or a lot of the people involved in the XMP UNICOS project. The Cray2 is not as good at compatibility to COS, in particular in the libraries. And this block structure was something that they put in 5.0 because of this compatibility. I don't think anyone's used it yet, waiting to see how it runs. The way you get block structure is the assign command in UNICOS. There's an option on the assign command telling the I/O libraries that this is a block dataset structure. In fact, the assign is how you specify what format you have for your files. So we do support it. And also our unblocked, which is the exact same thing as on COS, just raw data. I have the comment there for the XMP only. Really, the Cray2 starts falling in line, but I don't know if the Cray2 block structure is multi-file, whereas in the XMP it is multi-file blocked data sets, just like in COS. Also, getpos and setpos do not support blocked data sets.
Does that mean you're supporting multi-file files? Or block data sets?
There are file marks in the data set, just like in COS, with UNICOS 4.0, multi-file data sets. They're talking in 6.0.
Yourself to an end of file, does that
I'm not sure. I'll have to check on that. I would think on into file.
That seems so uncharacteristic of Unix. I mean, it's just so full.
Yeah, it's designed to be a Fortran standard type of thing of the way COS does it. But what you presently do not have still is a call. You can rewind, but you can't call rewind. And you also can't call copy skips. But there is talk of that being in 6.0. And I did have one application that did that. It basically, at the Fortran level, determined what range of data he wanted in the data set. And each file was a range of data. And then he would skip to the particular file in that data set that he wanted and pull in just that range. Obviously, that reduces buffer sizes and gives I/O performance. And we, in that case, just ran the application, tested it on one range of data. And we could have put it outside at the Fortran or at the shell level to split it apart and read in the particular file. There are a variety of things we could have done with that. She made the decision to wait till 6.0 and go back to site with what she had. And then the site, I'm sure, would deal with her at that point, whether they stop offering COS before 6.0 or something, or if the feature doesn't make 6.0. But that's a tough decision to make, is when you get into some of these calls, if there's going to be a future way of doing it. In particular, up till 5.0, there's been a lack of tape and a variety of things that now we have. So codes that got modified in the old days are now still in that other method of implementation, and possibly not worth re-implementing with the new feature. Depends upon what it's doing and whether it's a performance issue. But I'll check on that, because I know there's some I/O questions, and I'll get a couple people in here to answer some of them. Set pause, get pause. The only case I've ever seen that is around a buff in to check for accuracy, to see whether he made the correct transfer that he expected. And it was, in that case, commented out. It was just an error check. And he commented it out and left it at that point. I don't know whether he followed on with any rework on that, but that's the way we got around it and then ran the code from there. I mentioned file position across job steps. That's what this is kind of showing down here. An application broken into several executing steps, where the file position on a Fortran unit, for example, is expected to be at the same position as it left it from the previous step. Those are the ones that, the key is to find the thing executing in multiple steps. If you find that, then you've got to start questioning about file position retention and whether that's a problem application. And the answer is to get them wrapped into one job step and have some sort of stager program that makes the calls to the particular steps as needed, something like that.
Files get left open between steps. Can they be left open, or are they always closed?
I think they're always closed. Interfacing to routines in C library from Fortran, sometimes done. In particular, there's an iShell entry point that does that for you to make the system call, which executes things at the shell level. So iShell is a key to call, instead of calling, for example, call delete would be a call iShell with some sort of remove file. And that's where iShell comes in handy. Okay, application conversion steps, if we can go through this quickly. I got a couple of notes here that are on the side too. Here's basically what you're going to do. You first of all want to run and test the code on COS first and make sure it runs on COS. And save the output so that you can test that against the UNICOS counterpart. Oftentimes in our conversion projects, we just get the thing going on UNICOS and then go back and do this when we encounter problems or something. I did have a code, the last application conversion class, that did unformatted writes to standard out. And it was not accepted on UNICOS. We didn't think it would be accepted on COS either. It also had some stindex. There's a third variable on stindex for MS reads and writes that the libraries would not accept it without that third argument, so we had to add that. So this code we weren't sure ran on COS, and we never took the time to go back to COS to retest it. It was also missing an end-of-file marking between $in and the JCL, so it was questionable about what the code was. We thought it was a CDC code. So test it and save the output. You're going to verify that on UNICOS. Then you transfer it to UNICOS. 3 ways. The only way to get out of COS would typically be the station to the front end. And then you could go to UNICOS with a station link, if that's what you have. TCP, if your station supports TCP, then use TCP. And third method would be with tape. You can write a tape on COS, read it in on UNICOS, and then pull it apart. The tape subsystem doesn't care the format of that data, whether it's blocked or whatever, and then COS read can pull it apart. So we typically around here, when they bring codes up here, we mount them on the COS system and then transfer them across on the network. Implementation choices. Typically, I recommend people convert their generation job to a make file. Now, if your generation and run are in the same job on COS, you may want to consider splitting them apart. There's not much reason in my mind to recompile and link every time you run the code, and some sites do that. So I recommend makefile, and there's a command called fmgen which will automatically generate that for you, and it will also split apart the decks or the subroutines into individual files. So that has its trade-off. And within fmgen, then you can use CF or CF77 to do the compile, load, and go portion. And these are UNICOS 4.0 and 5.0 features. CF calls CFT in segloader. CFT77 calls CF77 calls CFT77 and segloader. And with 5.0, they do support auto tasking. So you could just quickly get them a generation job. In most cases, the run job has to be converted to an NQS script. I have seen users try to use NoHup, allows a process to run even if you lose connection with the terminal. But they were hitting time limits. NQS would be the real production workload stuff, the stuff that's going to take a lot of time to run. So in most cases, I think you will encounter having to generate an NQS script, which is simply taking a job card type of thing and mapping it to NQS directives at the top of a shell script. We're going to take a look at some of that. You also have to decide whether you're going to maintain your source on the mainframe or the front end. Depends upon how much file space you have. Where are you going to maintain your source for this application? And that really depends upon the site. A lot of people with MVS sites prefer maintaining source on an SPF editor. So I might point out that UNICOS is not very good at VI interactive editing. You get VI is a character I/O interrupt thing, and you get a lot of people using that. That's going to really load the system. We are looking at a variety of options to improve the interactive editing capability on a UNICOS system. But it doesn't make much sense to have 100 interactive users doing editing work on a supercomputer that should be number crunching. Not much work out of those floating point units. UNICOS command language is then dealt with next. The COS help, the appendices in your workbook, and some common sense can help you map out everything, including accesses, because we're going to talk about NQS temporary directories and stuff like that. Deal with any compiler differences and errors. This is where running it on COS is helpful, because you know what the compiler said on COS. You get a bunch of warning messages. If you know it said the same thing on COS, it's not as big a concern to you. Load errors. Loading errors are typically missing COS routines. This is the point where you start seeing how much work your application is going to take. All this earlier stuff typically takes a day and a half of work. But then once you identify missing library calls, then you're going to have to go through them case-by-case basis and figure out what you're going to do in UNICOS. Call iShell or whatever it is. And that is really the big time consumer in most application conversions. Run static debugging tools. I have two static debugging tools here, octldump and ftref. A variety of things that you can use, segloader maps as well, things like that. Then debug your binary if it's not working correctly. The common executing step problem is in the I/O areas. Usually there's some sort of I/O problem. For example, I was talking about an application that did not have a format statement on it to standard out. And this guy had to go through his code, and his implementation was all the source in one file. So he didn't know when he was going from one subroutine to the next. So every time he got to an unformatted write statement, he'd come up with a new format number to deal with it, because he didn't know whether he's in the same routine or not. He was using a pattern search and didn't know when he was jumping from one subroutine to the next. So he came up with a lot of time spent on fixing all these format number mismatches and typos and stuff like that. And that was the example here, was doing a Hollerith. He was doing a 1H1 right on the line write statement instead of with a format statement. But CDBX is the recommended tool to learn. It is a 5.0 feature. It can be backstitched onto 4.0. And I'll get you CDBX information and show you how it works later in the week. I/O differences. One of the key things I'm pointing out here is that standard in and standard out are Fortran units 5 and 6. And in UNICOS, they're pre-connected. You do not need an assign command for Fortran units 5 and 6. The Jcl Converter does not know how to deal with this. It cannot recognize Fortran unit 5 and 6. So it will blow the user off in the wrong direction. So instead of assigning them, you use I/O redirection. A.out is the executing binary, same as $ABD. Redirect data in, redirect data out. Then you verify the output. That's typically the scary part, because once in a while you get one number wrong out of 20,000 records or something like that. And then you have to start looking at finding out what's going on in that iteration of the step. Benchmark the application. For CPU-intensive applications, there's a JA command that can break down where your CPU time's being spent. HPM is the same thing as perfmon, hardware performance monitor information. Perftrace is supported, and the replacement for SPI in UNICOS is prof. And with UNICOS 5.0, it has the capability of giving you profile information down to the label within the subroutine. For I/O intensive stuff, there's a UNICOS 5.0 feature called procstat and proc report. And it also maintains memory utilization information in that same trace. And after you've benchmarked it, you also multitask the application. And with CFT77, we now have auto-tasking. Later in the week, anyone interested in auto-tasking, we could probably arrange somebody to come in and talk. And I'll definitely provide you with some handouts. And at that point, you've got a code up and running and working, and it's hopefully been as little effort as possible. Well, we're well past break time. I'm sorry it went so long there. Let's take a break for 15 minutes, come back at 22. So to begin with, in talking about the two systems, comparing COS and UNICOS features, the hardware support is probably the first thing a site should worry about. Does NCAR have a non-iOS machine?
We'll be getting the next creation.
Is that one going out then? Are you getting rid of your non-iOS?
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's a big thing, is we have no intention to put drivers for disks in the mainframe code. It's all been moved off to the iOS. And the iOS is the same as COS, and it's a packet communication between COS and the iOS, and UNICOS and the iOS. So hardware support will support everything but Cray 1A's Bs, because we can't support drivers for DCU23s. It's not worth the development effort. Our company position is we'd like to get those machines out of the field because they have so many modules, and the maintainability of those things goes down over the years. Parts are very difficult to get, etc. And we'd rather sell them YMPs and EAs and that sort of thing. So we are trying to phase out these machines, and there's no sense in putting code in there. Another thing to be careful of is NSC and FEIs, your networks that are attached to the mainframe, are not supported either. Now, it could be done if you're on site. You could write the driver code and stuff like that, but it is not in the system. There are sites that ran out of iOS channels and did move some of these to the mainframe, and they have a concern. They have to work out some sort of hardware channel configuration change or something like that, because there's no support for that. So those are the two gotchas. And I think that is about under 20 machines, but more than 10 right now. I don't know the exact status of those machines. I'm sure that some of those machines are going to stay out there forever. I know University of London would like to hang on to serial number 1 forever. At least that's the last I heard. So they will be running COS for a long time. Operating system features. They're both multi-user. I think UNICOS is a much more interactive environment. Typical workload on the system here, and this is not 5.0, but somewhere in a 4.0 post-production mode, I've seen getting up to 120 users before we start noticing severe response time and the system starts choking, if you want to call it that. So in typical classes in the past, when I start seeing problems on the terminals in response, we do a who and do a word count on that and figure out there are 120 users, 125 users on the system when that starts happening.
What system is that now?
That was, that particular case, I think, was 218. Yeah, it can vary from system to system. The YMP, when it came in, was, you could immediately see an interactive response difference between the Y and all the other machines, too. It was, you know, you could see the difference. It was fast, just in getting things back to the screen. But I would consider UNICOS a much more interactive environment. You wouldn't consider more than 20 interactive users on COS. And I've seen some pretty slow response times on COS as well, doing interactive audits and stuff like that. They're both multi-processing environments capable of using multiple CPUs and multi-threading. Multi-threading is better in UNICOS. There are a lot of advantages to UNICOS when you get down to the nitty-gritty details. Number of exchanges to initiate I/O. In COS, you have to go through all the tasks. In UNICOS, you just go to the kernel and do I/O. That's one exchange versus, I think I counted 8 or something like that. We can go through the scenario. The fact that the system calls are in the kernel are also multi-threaded, meaning that multiple system calls can be being processed by multiple CPUs at the same time. So we could have 8 CPUs in 8 different system calls all doing work at the same time. In COS, only 1 could be doing an executive request. The other 4 or other 3 would be sitting in a syswait idle loop. So multi-threading is the key, one of the key advantages that UNICOS offers us. And when we get into 64 CPU systems, those 63 CPUs won't be sitting waiting to do work. They can be doing something. Multitasking is also supported in both systems, and it is an identical implementation. Anything you know about the macro tasking library calls, they're the same calls. They've been ported. Anything you know about microtasking directives to the compilers are the same. And everything you know about autotasking is the same between the two systems. There's a command line difference, but the results and everything else is the same. So multitasking is an identical implementation. I was going to say that replacing the Unicos or Unix version. In Unix, they called it inter-process communication. And that's shared memory and stuff like that in a standard Unix system. That is how Unix people do inter-processor communication or multitasking. We do not support that. We feel our implementation is more efficient.